All right, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us at Tree Talk with the Metro Tree Advisory Committee. Wow, we just have people popping in. This is very exciting. We're glad that you are able to join us. Hopefully you have a sandwich. If we did these at 5 o'clock, I would say hopefully you have a beer. But if you're having a beer now, that's a whole other discussion. So hopefully you have a sandwich or lunch and you're joining us to learn more about trees in Nashville. We're going to start here shortly. People keep joining us. Thank you so much for joining us today at lunchtime to learn about trees. This is very exciting. We'll start here just in a moment. All right, if you've just joined us, thank you so much for taking time out during lunch to join the Tree Talk with the Metro Tree Advisory Committee. All right, I think we're going to go ahead and start. I think we've leveled out, if that's okay, Jennifer.
Yes.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Sharon Smith. I'm Assistant Director of Public Works, and I'm very excited today that you have joined us to listen in and ask questions during Tree Talk with the Metro Tree Advisory Committee, hosted by our very own horticulturalist and tree guru, Jennifer Smith. During the webinar, Jennifer will be talking to and interviewing two folks that she'll introduce to you shortly. But I would like you to consider questions that you might have during the meeting and type them in. If you look down at the bottom of your screen, you're going to see a couple of little bubbles with a Q&A. You could type questions in there, and then Jennifer and our wonderful guests will answer them at the end of the webinar. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer Smith. Jennifer, you're on.
Thank you, Sharon, and welcome. I'm extra excited today about talking natives. And we have two experts in that area. First, we're going to talk about why plant natives. And second, we're going to learn more about these two experts' favorite native trees that we can all consider planting in our own space. First, I want to introduce my partner in crime, Patricia Miller. Patricia chairs the Metro Tree Advisory Committee, which is a committee I coordinate through my job here at Public Works. And we have a good time talking trees. You kind of find your tree people, and it's a good place to be. So Patricia's favorite place is being outdoors. She has a degree in biology and a master's in interpretive biology. She's worked as a naturalist and has worked in museum education as well as the Tennessee Wildlife Resource Agency. She is an advocate, and when I say advocate, she is a big advocate for native plants and animals and their habitat. Patricia, do you want to share just a little bit about the Metro Tree Advisory Committee that you chair?
I'll be glad to. The Metro Tree Advisory Committee is a committee appointed under the Metro Beautification Environment Commission, and our purpose is tree planting and preservation. And there are about 40 people on the committee, and I'd say a quarter represents the different departments of Metro that have anything to do with trees, like Public Works and parks and general services and planning and Metro Water Services and codes. And the other, there's arborists on the committee. There are landscape designers and private citizens like myself that are just, and also our tree nonprofits are all represented on our committee. And it's basically everyone, it's the tree people. And we are the ones that really hope to influence the future of Nashville's trees.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce Richard Hitt, who also serves on the Metro Tree Advisory Committee. He had a career in academia. He's a certified Tennessee naturalist with the Tennessee Naturalist Program. He enjoys volunteering and leading interpretive hikes. He likes to volunteer at nature centers with native plant gardening, and he also likes to do invasive plant removals. So in 2018, Richard and others came together and started a chapter here of the Wild Ones, who Richard serves as president. Richard, would you like to tell us a little bit about the Wild Ones? Richard, we can't hear you.
This must be better.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, the Wild Ones is a national nonprofit organization founded in Wisconsin. I believe it became a nonprofit in 1992, but it was kind of a club thing before that. But the purpose of the Wild Ones nonprofit is to support the use of native plants in the landscape and to support the use of sustainable landscaping practices. So I and a few other native plant enthusiasts got together in 2018 and decided to see if we could form the third chapter of Wild Ones in the state of Tennessee. And things are going pretty well for us, despite the horrible stuff that's going on with COVID. But we have about 70, 75
Wow.
members at any given moment. We have a mailing list of about 500 people that follow us, but don't necessarily participate in chapter activities, although that's easier now with Zoom. So our attendance has actually gone up a little bit, that you can go to a Wild Ones meeting by walking across to your living room. But we do a lot of work in the community, native plant gardening. Yesterday, a group of us removed invasive plants from in Giles County to help save the Porter's goldenrod was the plant we were trying to get some light on down there. So we took out a lot of trees, young trees, old trees, and now the goldenrod has a lot more sunlight, and it only exists in this one location in Giles County in Tennessee. It's in other states as well. But so we just try to support the use of native plants and do what we can to make the world a better place. Thank you.
I appreciate both of you all's passion for trees. And you can go to the Wild Ones website if you'd like to learn more about trees and wild ones. There we go. So Patricia, do you want to lead us off here?
Sure. Just some basic definitions, and I guess I'll just read them. I know people can read them themselves, but a native plant is a plant that lives or grows naturally in a particular region without direct or indirect human intervention. A cultivar is a plant variety that has been produced in cultivation by selective breeding. They are clones and they lack genetic diversity.
Patricia's always given me a lecture on the need to plant more natives. I have a background in horticulture and landscape design, and I'm always thinking of the trees, and a lot of the Asian trees do well here. And she goes, "Oh, we got to plant more natives," so she's getting to me.
Good.
That's right.
Invasive species. Invasive species is an organism that causes ecological or economic harm in a new environment where it is not native. Invasive species are capable of causing extinctions of native plants and animals, reducing biodiversity, competing with native organisms for limited resources, and altering habitats. And I don't know if anybody has been on a weed wrangle, but that's where we try to remove invasive species.
That's right. That's an initiative that was started actually here in Nashville, and it's going across the country. And you can go to the Weed Wrangle website and learn how you can volunteer. Many of us have done it for all these years. Was it 5 or 6 now? And it's fun. It's a great day to get out and make a difference in your community.
And by the way, I think Weed Wrangle is now spread to 16 states, and the National Park Service has picked it up. It's pretty amazing.
It's on its way.
Yes. Okay. I know a lot of people here on the ticket that's stuck into the plant you buy, what kind of sun that the plant takes. And I just thought we might clarify what that means. And also when we talk about the trees, it might be good to know when we're saying full sun, it means 6 or more hours of direct sun per day, and part sun, 4 to 6 hours. And part shade, 4 to 6 hours of direct sun, mostly before midday.
And morning sun can be tough.
Yes, and full shade, less than 4 hours of direct sun per day. And I've also heard less than 2 hours. So that's a little not absolutely sure about that definition. And the other thing that we talk about is our canopy. And people say, well, exactly what is the canopy? That's the upper level of a forest. And sometimes trees are canopy trees, and sometimes they are the understory trees. And you can see the understory of the trees and shrubs growing between the forest canopy and the forest floor. And then one of the other things that's so important, especially right here in Nashville area in the Central Basin, is how acid is the soil or how alkaline. And since we were formed, the Nashville Basin was formed by sea creatures who deposited when the seas were covered the basin, and the shells that they had became the limestone, a lot of calcium. It was actually mostly calcium. That is now under, and it was a dome actually, and the dome fell down because it eroded underneath. And we have the rim around our dome now that was a harder sandstone. But that makes our soil more alkaline than acidic. And a lot of times plants that we buy like more acidic soil. And plants actually, most in general, prefer slightly acidic soil. So we have challenges here in the Central Basin. Next.
So getting back to the canopy and understory, the area where I mostly work in is the street trees. And anytime we don't have overhead power lines, we really encourage the planting of canopy trees that will come out and be shade and provide all the benefits for air quality and stormwater. Just something to consider.
Okay, Richard, you want to take it from here, sir? Can't hear you yet.
Okay, this should be better. In 2007, Doug Tallamy, who's a professor of entomology at University of Delaware, came out with a book called Bringing Nature Home. It was an immediate success, illustrating the need to use more native plants and the impact that not taking aggressive action in that direction would have on biodiversity. The biodiversity is just biological diversity shortened into biodiversity. The term was coined in the late 60s and became fashionable to use in the 80s. But it has to do with keeping a good collection of different species and not letting species go extinct. And so last year, when the UN came out with its report on biodiversity, the first sentence is, nature is declining globally at rates unprecedented in human history, and the rate of species extinction is accelerating with grave impacts on people around the world. And the sentence goes on, but that's pretty much the report right there. You don't need to hear much else. And so we're at risk for losing lots of our species, which could unstabilize the ecosystem, which could have pretty horrible effects. So we're not going to focus on the gloom and doom today. We're going to focus on what we can do to help things out. And Tallamy's new book came out in February this year, sorry. And it reinforces with new research and evidence what his theme was back in 2007 with Bringing Nature Home. Tallamy is not a pessimist either. He's quite an optimist. So it's a fairly upbeat and uplifting book. He dispenses with the bad news in the first chapter and moves on with several more chapters of good news.
I know both of you are fans of Doug's and talk about him a lot. And these are reference books for anybody interested. So we're going to talk about why. Why should we plant native trees?
That sounds like me.
That's right.
I'm going to start off with some sort of minor benefits of using native plants and save the big gun for the end. So I'm not going to get bogged down in these first slides, but native plants evolved to survive in this area, in this climate or something close to what it used to be. And they don't need fertilizer. You need fertilizer if there's some plant deficiency, and only in rare cases would you need to use fertilizer with native plants if you're using native plants from this area. Native plants also don't need pesticides. In fact, that's like the worst thing you can do because you're killing off all the insects that are eating the plant so they can then become bird food or whatever they're going to do. So since the native plants co-evolved here with the native insects, they get along quite nicely. You have a problem if you have an invasive insect that comes in from another country, another area. And in that case, you might choose to use pesticides to control that one insect. It's not an easy decision though, because pesticides are general ingredients and not things that focus on one species. But the importance of insects in the food web was illustrated when E.O. Wilson wrote his paper, Insects Are the Little Things That Run the World. The world could get by just fine if humans disappeared, but if insects disappear, we've got an actual problem. So we want to embrace insects for the good that they do in the preservation of biodiversity. And the Xerxes Society has been preaching that for a long, long time.
You note the emerald ash borer, and just for general information, we do host an emerald ash borer epidemic in Nashville webinar as well. That's been very helpful.
Native plants, again, because they co-evolved here, they're used to the climate that they're growing in. Even with global warming, we don't see a big difference yet, although that's could certainly be coming. So my statement here is that native plants can save water, especially if you use native plants to replace some of your lawn. Lawn is one of the most water needy plants you can put out there. It's not native here. It's if you have a perfect lawn, you have a monoculture that really doesn't serve biodiversity in any good way. If you use native plants, also they tend to have root systems compatible with the rainfall that we get here. Native grasses, for example, can have root systems that go down as far as 10 feet. There's a lot of water storage ability for native plants. And so you can reduce the runoff if you use native plants in that way as well.
Great tool. Okay.
Now, native plants themselves don't clean the air any better, as far as I know, than exotic plants. But I'm thinking in terms of if you replace part of your lawn with native plants, then you're going to keep the air cleaner, because you don't have to use the gasoline-powered tools to either trim your hedges or mow your lawn. And those things are really quite polluting. And so that's because we regulate cars pretty well, but we don't regulate the gasoline-powered lawn equipment.
Good point.
So here's the big gun. So I'll spend a little more time on this one. Native plants support the food web and promote biodiversity far better than non-natives do. And so we've gotten away from using the phrase food chain, because it's really not a chain where just one animal eats the next up the line, but it's really more like a web where you have several animals interacting with any given other animal. Now, as native plants evolved, they don't really want to be eaten, and then consequently, they've developed some chemical characteristics that make them taste bad in some cases. But insects have been busy as well. They were here before the flowering plants were, but once the flowering plants arrived, they evolved in a way that they could use the flowering plants in a way that the plants benefited from the insects. So over time, some insects developed some enzymes that helped them digest the bad tasting plants. So the kind of poster child of that would be the monarch butterfly, developed a mechanism to digest milkweed leaves. Milkweed leaves do not taste good. In fact, they're sort of poisonous. But the monarchs were able to get around that through some very clever adaptations. So plants capture the energy from the sun. And if nothing ate the plants, that would just be a dead end. The energy would be captured and just sit there in the plants and go back into the earth when it died. But what happens is the insects, for example, and other animals can eat plants. That moves the energy through the ecosystem, and that process continues. And how that process continues is really what the food web is all about. So that energy that the plants, and only the plants, are able to capture from the sun and turn into food is moved through the ecosystem all the way. Exotic plants that did not evolve with our native insects typically don't support plant-animal interactions nearly as well. And I think somewhere, I have the example that if you compare a ginkgo tree to an oak tree, the ginkgo tree supports maybe one caterpillar, whereas a typical oak tree supports several hundred. So that's the story right there. Okay. And so to further that point, exotic plants aren't always dead ends. A lot of times they produce nectar that the insects use, but in terms of consuming the leaf material, that doesn't happen often. Once in a while I'll see a moth caterpillar chewing on a burning bush or something like that. It's just kind of a random event. If you take native plants, you typically can find lots of caterpillars that can digest their leaf material. So what is the problem? Well, the problem is that when we didn't have many people living here, we could kind of ignore all of this, and there was still plenty of native plants to go around and support biodiversity, and the ecosystem was in good balance. But with the amount of urbanization that has occurred and the amount of lawn that we have and the amount of exotic plants that we've brought in, that's broken up with what was once a functioning ecosystem into tiny fragments that are not connected well. And it's just not large enough to support the wildlife as we know it. So here's the example I was alluding to a moment ago, that birds typically need thousands of caterpillars to raise a single clutch of chicks. Now, this has been studied very carefully with chickadees, less well with others, and not all birds need caterpillars to raise their young, but many do. It's really the perfect food for young chicks. It's full of protein and fat, doesn't have sharp objects on the outside like beetles do. It's just like a ball or a tube of fat and protein. So it's perfect for the mother and father to stuff down the throat of a chick. Now, where are the birds going to find the caterpillars? Well, they're not going to find it on the ginkgo tree, but they will on a native tree, especially an oak or a Prunus genus tree like cherry. So using more native plants will help reverse the current rapid loss of biodiversity, which was mentioned in that UN report and then that I mentioned a minute ago. Okay.
So now we're going to go into some of the favorite trees of Patricia and Richard. And this is a quote from Patricia because she had a hard time. So, and yes, it's like choosing your favorite child or maybe your favorite cat, Patricia.
Yes.
You have a lot of cats.
Yes. Actually, I think Richard said this, and we both laughed because it's nearly impossible. But here goes. I'll tell you my.
Now, I have to say this would be one of my favorite tops here.
Okay. The white oak. The white oak, because one raised me. I grew up next to a really big white oak, and my parents took great pride and joy in that tree, and of course that was passed on to me. And when I was a child, we had a 2-story house, and that tree was probably double the height of our house, and it was a beautiful tree. And this is a canopy tree. Obviously, it grows really tall, and the great, wonderful thing about it, it will last forever. You plant one today, your children and grandchildren will get to enjoy it if it is able to live, be in the right conditions. And it likes full sun, and it can tolerate some dry soil, and of course, medium moist soil would be great for it. And being an oak tree, we've just talked about that. In fact, we can go on to the next slide, Jennifer. The cherry bark oak. This is probably a faster growing oak tree, and it's more of a West Tennessee tree, maybe because it prefers a moist soil. But we have them in our yard, and they really grow fast. They can live in those poor, drier soils, but it has a great bark, and it makes a great tree for you as well. Okay, the next slide. Oh, and this is probably a favorite of a lot of people. This bur oak has the largest acorns of any oak, and they will live forever too in the right conditions. And all of these oaks, maybe go to the next slide, are just excellent sources of food. As Richard has mentioned, many moths and butterflies lay eggs, and the caterpillars eat the leaves. Many animals depend on oak trees. They're a mainstay of our ecological systems here in this country. Just to give you an idea of some of the butterflies and moths, and of course the wildlife such as the deer and turkeys, squirrels, rabbits, raccoons, and chipmunks and squirrels, and I said squirrels already, eat the forage for the food, for the acorns. And people can eat acorns. And actually, one more point, the white oaks, which was the white oak and the bur oak, have acorns every year. The red oak every other year. Next slide, please. Now I get these two confused, so I thought, doggone it, I'll just put it in both here. And the one on the right, on the left, that would be the left, okay. The American hornbeam, it likes the shade. And the one on the right likes the sun. Both are approximately the same height. Did I get that right? No, I didn't. Well, anyway, the ironwood can tolerate more sun than the musclewood. But look at that trunk on the musclewood. You can just see its sinewy bark there, and it's really very neat to look at. And the ironwood, the American hop hornbeam, has the shaggy bark. And these are moderately height growing trees. So they will do fine in a yard. Thank you.
We do get a lot of questions from people landscaping. What are the medium to smaller size trees? And this would be two good examples.
The slight challenge on those two, and that's okay, is they like the slightly acidic soil, but they will live here and on our soil. Okay. And here are a few of the butterflies, a butterfly, and I just couldn't help but enjoy the caterpillar. It's so rough and tumble looking, and then it makes this beautiful red spotted purple butterfly. Okay, let's see. You can read the different things, the different songbirds and turkeys, and sometimes beavers will eat the bark. And on the hornbeam, on the hop hornbeam, the nutlets are eaten by songbirds, wild turkeys, quail, and small mammals. Okay, thank you. Next. And I know everyone has seen the eastern redbud. They are just most beautiful in the spring. They will grow almost anywhere in the sun and shade, and in many soil types. It's just a workhorse for our landscape. In our yard, we probably have 30 or 40, and they keep seeding. And I keep giving the seedlings to another organization that will take those seedlings. Okay, thank you. Just to give you an idea of what the redbud will support, 12 species of Lepidoptera, which is your butterflies and moths. This leaf cutter, in fact, it will actually do more than that. And we need those little beads for pollinating, right? Okay, I love the name of this butterfly, the Henry's elfin butterfly. It's a host plant for both the caterpillar and the adult. Okay, and songbirds and small mammals occasionally eat the seeds. It's a really good, again, a workhorse for us. Thank you, Jennifer. Okay, and serviceberry is a beautiful, beautiful plant. We have some in our yard here. They are also small trees. They can tolerate shade, partial shade, and sun. They like moist, well-drained soil, but can live in a slightly drier soil. They have probably the first flowers in the spring. If you're driving in the country and you see flowers, and sort of really beautiful lacy flowers in the woods, it's probably a serviceberry. It's early spring. And the berries are wonderful. You can eat them, but you probably won't get to them before the animals do. And I have seen the serviceberry that we had beside our deck. I would see summer tanagers right from my kitchen window, just enjoying the berries. Okay, thank you. American hazelnut. To be honest, I don't have personal experience with this tree, but it will grow here and it will grow very well. It's another small tree, and it can take the full sun, partial shade, a variety of soil types, and is drought tolerant. And next slide, it has those wonderful, wonderful nuts.
I love this.
You can eat them. I figured that was a bear that had his fill of hazelnuts, possibly. And of course, the chipmunk is enjoying probably an acorn, really, but many, many animals will eat the hazelnuts, including us. And the twigs and leaves are browsed by white-tailed deer. So this is the wildlife value for that. Thank you. And the last for me is American smoke tree. If you want a flowering tree that's just a showstopper, here it is, and it will live in our yards. And it's not a lot of people know about this. I don't have this one. I want this one. It's another moderate growing tree, not too tall, and full sun, and it can stand that poor soil that we find sometimes in our yards. Thank you.
I know as a child, there was a neighbor around the corner that had one in their yard. And it just fascinated me, got my attention.
Next slide, please. And I want to remind you, that's an American smoke tree and not an Asian smoke tree. Okay, here, good cover for nesting for birds and mammals. And our native finches like the seeds. And that's a small native finch here, our indigo bunting. I just thought that was a beautiful bird. Okay. I think that's my slides there.
Now we're going to Richard's favorite native trees.
Thank you, Patricia. That was interesting. I'm a big fan of the smoke tree, big fan of the red bud. Patricia and I got together on this, and we were going to come up with one list, but after Patricia's list was finalized, we decided to make a short list for me as well. So we'll just dive right in. Patricia has lauded the benefits of many oaks. We have at least 20, we have more than 20 native oaks in Tennessee. And there's 12 reds I can think of, and 8 white group oaks that we have here. And so we have oaks for uplands, lowlands, that can support or can take benefit of wherever you need an oak just about. So my personal favorite oak is the Shumard oak. I have several in my backyard, even though it's a small backyard. I'm actually counting the HOA property behind my yard as my backyard. But what really strikes me about the Shumard oak is the color in the fall. So that color in that picture is really not exaggerated. It's not a picture I took, but that's what I see in my Shumard oaks on a good year. And I think we're having a good year this year, even though it hasn't gotten here yet, but we'll wait and see. As with any oak, there are a lot of lepidopteran species, and this number 432 applies to the Nashville area. The National Wildlife Foundation has installed a kind of beta tested app that if you type in your zip code, it will tell you what trees support the most wildlife in terms of caterpillars, at least, and what shrubs support the most wildlife where you are, at least in terms of caterpillars. And so the oaks for here collectively support 432. That number changes a bit each year as more research comes out. But it's just genus level information. That's because historically, the entomologists, when they see a caterpillar on a tree, they just record the genus. And so only now are the entomologists getting down to the species level, and it's going to take a long time for the backlog to clear on that. So we're kind of stuck with genus level information for a while longer, but it's very useful. So the pawpaw was my next choice. It is a small tree. It is an understory tree, and it's very, very colonial. That is, if you plant one, you're likely to have a lot more nearby that are the exact same genotype as the one you planted. The tree is what we call self-incompatible. It cannot pollinate itself. It has to pollinate something with a different genetic makeup. And so that's why you have in the woods, you'll find one set of pawpaw trees in a patch that are probably all genetically identical. But on the other side of the hill, you might have another pawpaw patch. And so it requires an insect to take the pollen from one patch and deposit it on the other patch. So that's how that works. But you do have to have at least 2 pawpaws to be successful in getting fruit, which is one of the main goals, I think, in having a pawpaw tree. It doesn't support a lot of butterflies and moths, but it still is doing its share to keep biodiversity alive. And the squirrels are quite fond of the pawpaw. The problem that I have with it is that the squirrel's standard of ripeness is a little lower than my own. So by the time I'm ready to eat a pawpaw, it's usually already gone. But it's definitely helping the squirrels and other animals get some good nutrition. One of the 13 lepidopteran species that pawpaws support in terms of a host plant is the zebra swallowtail butterfly. Now, sometimes a butterfly can host on different plants, but in the case of the zebra swallowtail, I believe that the pawpaw is the only plant it can host on. So that's kind of a highly specialized situation, and it's also highly risky because if a pawpaw as a genus, as a species, ever develops a problem, it's going to be bad news for the zebra swallowtail butterfly. We may be seeing that unfold with the spicebush swallowtail butterfly only hosts on 2 plants, and both of those may be under attack pretty soon, but we can talk more about that later. Okay, so why would I pick red cedar when they're all over the place? Well, red cedars have a lot of good uses. First off, they're great for the environment because birds love to hide out in there. They produce edible berries, and they host, 28 different species of caterpillar. That's a picture of a juniper hair streak that I took at Owl's Hill Nature Sanctuary during the last butterfly count. There are lots of ways you can use red cedar, and if you're willing to open the door to considering cultivars, you can have shrubs that are red cedars. You can have pencil shaped trees that are red cedars, and you can use them in their natural form where they're a good screening. What I like to do is put them as a backdrop. I have several planted at the far end of the HOA property behind my house, and then in front of that, if you put, say, something like a witch hazel or something with a yellow or purple or whatever bloom, wow, it's really going to pop. I'm still working on that second part of the process, but I've got the first part taken care of where I have the backdrop set in. The reason I picked black cherry is because when you're designing your yard or landscape and you want to help biodiversity, you want to put in things like oaks that host many, many different butterflies, caterpillars. And surprisingly, to me at least, black cherry is way up there in the number of caterpillars that it supports. The number for this area, the Nashville area, is 320. And that's, again, genus wide, so the black cherry itself may not support quite that number itself, but that's the best information we have. It's fairly tolerant in terms of sun. I've seen it, certainly in full sun, but it can actually do pretty well without a lot of light. And it doesn't have much moisture requirements, so it's a good plant to have. And if you look at the flower, it's a spike of flowers here. It's really quite striking in the spring. Yeah, I think red maple is a bit underused, even though it's a very common tree. But like in my neighborhood, I have one in my front yard that was there when I moved in, but I don't know where another one is. And yet there are lots of sugar maples in my neighborhood. The red maple, the squirrels really love to just eat the flower, and they really have a good time in there. And there are 2 or 3 squirrel nests in the red maple that I can see that you can't right out the window here. But it's got striking and really stunning fall color when the conditions are right. And so the orange and red glow that I get is really amazing.
Beautiful.
So red maples, I guess I forgot to mention how many caterpillar species they support, but it's a lot. That's 229 is not a small number when you're talking about caterpillar hosting. Well, I thought that imperial moth was just too strange and beautiful to pass up, so I put a picture of that in there. But mostly the animals that I see from my window having fun and consuming the red maple are the squirrels. Okay, so I thought I'd take a risk. Um, I'm guessing that many of you have not heard of the two-winged silver bell, Elysia diptera. I grew up on the Gulf Coast, and I wasn't into plants at the time. I not only grew up there, I just moved away when I was 54. So, but like I said, I wasn't really aware of details about plants. I appreciated trees and wanted to learn more, but they were just sort of there. And so I did not appreciate the two-winged silverbell at the time when I lived in the area that is in its native range. So the native range of this two-winged silverbell is really the lower half of Alabama, lower half of Georgia, a good bit of Louisiana, and then it kind of fades out in the Carolinas. But remember, we're in a process of global warming. And so it's actually encouraged by a lot of tree experts that we begin experimenting with some trees from the south, farther south, and see how well they do in our environment. And that experiment has already been done with this tree. It actually does very well and doesn't need much light at all. And so if you look at the tree on the left, I can't really, it looks like it probably does get a lot of sun, but that's a stunning display of white flowers in the spring. It doesn't require a lot of moisture, but there's not much known about how many caterpillars it might support. It's not in the database that the National Wildlife Foundation has, National Wildlife Federation has. So those are my contributions to favorite trees to just augment what Patricia did.
Thank you. We're going to take questions, but before, I just have a few slides I just want to share to let you all know more about what's happening in our community as far as trees go. The tree organizations here in Nashville, of course, the Metro Tree Advisory Committee we talked about, the Nashville Tree Foundation, they've been out planting trees since 1986, and they're in the middle of their fall tree planting season and need volunteers. Go on their website. Root Nashville is a campaign, a citywide campaign to plant 500,000 trees by 2050. And that means we need everyone to plant a tree in their yard. Now, just as important, please go on their website and map that tree so it can be counted. They have a map, you can just put a dot where you planted that tree. It's kind of a fun thing to get to do. But again, everyone is involved in that. All the different organizations, tree planting organizations are. And then the Nashville Tree Conservation Corps is another group. They're in the middle of making Shelby Street here in East Nashville arboretum, and they need volunteers as well. So these are different tree organizations that are making a difference in our city. So here's the tree Root Nashville program, and see when you plot your tree, this number will go up. So it's kind of exciting. Tree Corps. And then we touch base, but the emerald ash borer epidemic is in Nashville. We saw a lot of decline last growing season. We estimate that there's 1.6 million ash trees in our county, and unless they are treated, they will die. So perhaps you will be interested in taking one of our webinars on what you can do to help manage emerald ash borer in Nashville. Just wanted to throw this in. The Tennessee Urban Forestry Council hosts some tree programs. One is our Arboretum Certification Program. It's for 3 years for certification, and statewide, I think they have about 160 arboretums going on. So that's fun to go and look on their website about all the different places you might choose to go visit and learn more about trees. And what you can do in your own yard is they have this tree sanctuary program where you have to have at least 10 tree species, and you will get this handsome plaque that you can put in your yard. So these are recognition programs, but something you might want to consider. And now we have questions, but before Sharon brings on any questions, we had one emailed into me earlier, and it's about small yards. So small yards, small trees, what would be some good suggestions for full sun or shade? Richard and Patricia, do you want to discuss that for a moment?
I think we had a unanimous response on that question. Richard, is that right? Redbud.
That is correct. Yeah, redbud is very versatile, very stable, not a lot of difficulty making it happy. So it does well in anything from full sun all the way down to just a small small shade.
I want to add one point that people may not know, that if you buy a cultivar that is, say, a red bud that has red leaves, really the burgundy leaves, insects don't like them. The leaves have something in them that the caterpillars don't want to eat.
So that would be like the forest pansy.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to choose to support the caterpillars, then I would go with the more straight species.
And when you go with the cultivar, you're really kind of rolling the dice. You need to kind of look into and see if sometimes the cultivar makes no difference at all. Other times it does. But in either case, you have zero biodiversity in a cultivar. You're doing the opposite of what we need to do to support biodiversity, because cultivars are all genetically identical within a given strain.
And if the flower has changed, the butterflies may not, like a double bloom or something, the butterflies may not be able to use it. The height might not make such a difference, but it's easy with a cultivar to miss the whole ecological support that you really would like to do.
Interesting. Sharon, do we have any questions?
We have quite a few questions, Jennifer. Let's start at the top. What has killed so many crepe myrtle trees in Nashville? And I just have to say, I'm a huge fan of crepe myrtles, although I'm never sure if they're trees or shrubs.
I don't know what the problem is there.
Jennifer, I know, can probably answer this better than most of us. But we did have a drought last fall, and we have had some freezes that were pretty harsh on the crepe myrtle. By the way, it is not a native tree. It is not a native plant. I love them too. I have 2 in my yard, but it's not a native plant. Jennifer, any more to add?
Well, I think too, we've gotten a lot of questions about that, the crepe myrtle and evergreens, the firs in general. And yes, kind of the drought followed by an early freeze in November last year. I think that the two really combined to put these plants under stress. Now, the nice thing about the crepe myrtles is you'll have to prune them, and the new shoots will come out, so you won't have lost your tree shrub.
And they are very slow to leaf out in the spring, so I always urge patience. Just wait and see with them, and then later you could take out the dead.
All right, here's a good question. Trees are being cut down in my neighborhood. I wonder if we could ever require a permit for somebody to cut down a healthy tree.
So we get that question quite a bit. So in the commercial area, if you have a tree that's over 6 inches in diameter, you do have to get a permit through our codes department, our urban forester there. But it doesn't apply to the homeowner's yard, the private property. The Tree Advisory Committee has a program called the Historic and Specimen Tree Program that helps to preserve a tree that gets put into that program. But other than that, at this time, I know other cities do have permitting for trees on a residential lot, but we do not here in Nashville at this time.
I understand that in Atlanta, that when people go out to do development, the first thing that they're supposed to do is to go out and see what trees they can save and how many.
And we do that here in Nashville for our commercial properties, but for our residential, as far as cutting down a specimen big old tree, that's not part of what we oversee.
All right. Please talk about native ground covers if you have time, the kind that you would use to replace turf.
Well, that's a good one. There are native ground covers. I can't tell you right offhand. It's not monkey grass. It's not ajuga. It's not vinca, for heaven's sake, no. Or ground ivy, no. Depends on the height that you want. I think that's a question for a book like this one, which is Gardening with the Native Plants of Tennessee, The Spirit of Place, Margie Hunter. And so our Tennessee native plants, and she features it by vines, grasses, shrubs, and trees. I would recommend that. Again, it's the Gardening with the Native Plants of Tennessee. There are ground covers you can find that are suitable and support the ecology. But I don't have a quick answer. I'm sorry.
The ground covers that you can use in a garden setting are easy to figure out. And so what Wildlands recommends is that you not replace your lawn with a ground cover, but that you extend your native plantings in your garden areas and leave paths. And so for ground covers in a garden setting, if it's a shade garden, you could use, let's see, it's Pachysandra procumbens, but I'm trying to think of the common name of that. It's not the Pachysandra that, it's not the non-native Pachysandra, but it's Pachysandra procumbens. It has a kind of cute white spike flower, and it stays very low to the ground, but it's not something you would want to walk on every day because it probably wouldn't hold up with that. But another garden ground cover for shade is commonly called green and gold. It has green leaves and these yellow flowers, and it's evergreen. It's almost evergreen. It just starts looking a little bad in the winter, but it comes back really strong, and it will cover a garden area as quickly as you let it. Once it gets started, it's quite happy. So there are plants like that that are native that you can use in your garden to do a ground cover, but it's a little harder when you get out and you're wanting something to walk on in the yard. So there are some Carex species, Carex, that are fairly low to the ground, that are kind of rough, and you could walk on them a little bit, but there really is no equivalent substitute that I know of for a turf grass. But you can approximate it.
The Hypericum is a nice ground cover, but you're right. None of these are particularly, would you want to walk on? But I like that concept, Richard, that you mentioned of just extending your garden into your yard, so you just have pathways, and therefore you don't have areas to mow.
Mm-hmm.
Next.
All right. What is the best way to plant a tree from a pot?
Ooh.
Who wants to dive on that one?
So
plant the tree. Go, Jennifer.
Well, I just want to note that we at trees.nashville.gov have a planting area at the top that talks about how to plant a tree from a balled and burlap or from a container grown tree. So we have handout flyers that illustrate this. And we have a video that we did in-house here so that people can actually, when they're out in their yard or wherever they're planting, can YouTube the video and make sure they're doing it correctly. But I would just mention that you really want to protect the root zone of the tree. So don't pick up the tree by the trunk and put all the weight down here, because that could really break off some roots. And the main thing that you have to be aware of is the roots more than likely will be circling, and then underneath they'd be matted up, and you have to redirect those roots. You can slice through them and redirect them with your fingers. Sometimes you have to be really tenacious so that the roots grow outward. Otherwise, that tree roots will continue to go this way, and I'll have issues with the tree growth. But Patricia?
I wanted to add that I heard someone say, buy the smallest tree that you can afford. And really, in our yard, we had 2 acres that were grass, and my husband's a forester, and we planted over 300 seedlings, tree seedlings, different oaks and hickories and redbuds and serviceberry, and I know a lot. And that was 24 years ago, and now we have trunks 18 to 20 inches.
Wow.
That's a lot. But they were all bare root seedlings, and they sometimes will grow faster than the ball and burlap trees that will catch up to them, and they are certainly easier to plant, and they get adjusted to the native soil really quickly. And I just recommend them. You don't have to have start with a big tree. It's easier to start with a small one, and maybe more successful.
Okay, so we've got quite a few more questions. I'm going to pop in here for Sharon. So our next question is, are there native fruit trees? I remember a wild plum tree we used to have.
There is a wild plum tree, the Chickasaw plum, and I think there might be another plum.
Portland, maybe.
Yes, and they would be great here. And sometimes we've been able to give out those seedlings at the Lawn and Garden Show, but we haven't had access to those seedlings. The native plum are terrific. They bloom early in the spring, and of course they provide fruit for wildlife. I would recommend the Chickasaw plum. And again, Richard, what was that?
Hortulin, H-O-R.
Hortulin. Okay.
The black cherry, the fruit of that is edible and tasty.
All right, our next question, does anyone do tree or nature consulting coming to someone's house?
Well, there are companies in town that do that. Wild Ones does that on a volunteer basis, but I would recommend you use a professional and not a bunch of amateurs giving out free advice. But yeah, there are 2 native plant nurseries in Fairview that both do that kind of work. I'm sure there are landscape designing companies in town that you can contract with to come out and do a survey. If on the Wild Ones website, it's middletennessee.wildones.org. There's a resources tab, and I have a few of those companies listed there. But there are others, and so you could just do a Google search and come up with pretty much the same list.
And also the Ag Extension Service people might be of help to the Davidson County Ag Extension people.
I think we have time for one more question.
All right, I'm just going down the list. So the last question then will be, what about pine trees and evergreen type trees?
Well, I just can't help but say what I want to say about that. The Eastern red cedar is our only native conifer / evergreen in the Central Basin. And when we plant other pine trees, they will struggle. They might make it, but they are not our native conifer. And the Eastern red cedar has a fabulous long taproot. That's how it survives all the droughts that we have periodically. And I highly recommend the Eastern red cedar. Favorite. Okay, anybody else?
Well, the pine trees, this isn't part of their natural range, but they certainly can do okay here. But the Eastern red cedar, with its different cultivars, can serve a lot of different needs. I was going to mention in passing that on the ground cover, Joanna is recommending wild violet, Viola sororia. And her yard has a lot of violets in it. And I guess she's using it more or less as a ground cover there.
And you have to be careful too of ones that become invasive.
It's important to the wild violet, one of the ones that's native here. She's recommending this sororia, Sororia, as the species.
Well, thank you, Richard and Patricia. I really appreciate your time and your expertise. It has been fun, and I've learned a lot, and I hope everyone else has as well. And go to trees.nashville.gov and participate in one of our many tree organizations. They're having these fall plantings. The Tree Corps is having a tree sale that you might consider participating in to get a tree planted in your own yard. And remember, Root Nashville, we've all got to work together and plant trees and map them on their map.
And I'll just throw in there, just for those of you that did not get your questions answered, that email address is up there and you can email those questions there to get your questions answered. This has also been recorded, so we'll be sending everybody a follow-up with the recording, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.